aversive racism, it is the concept of it is really looking at someone who believes that they have they're progressive, they have they they don't believe that they have what they're thinking of as overt racism, and they don't understand that there is these unconscious views that they have, and they display it, not they're not intentionally displaying it, but they do it in an aversive way. And I think the way to think about it is you have to look at it from a couple different concepts. And so the article really is sort of outlining it from the perspective of taking these very, critical and influential social psychology concepts. So first, I always like to explain it in that we have to acknowledge that there is a hierarchy. There's a group-based hierarchy that we have in this country, and that's been studied using social dominance theory, and it's been talked about in other ways. But we have this dominant group that sort of holds this power that society values. It's money, career, prestige. They have they have this dominant position. And there is the other groups below them who don't have those positions, but obviously are striving for that. And it's a way that we sort of keep it. And I think it's been written about a lot. There's a great book out called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson that really outlines this hierarchy and shows the history of it. And so I thought it was fascinating. As I was reading it, I had already started to draft the concept of this article as I was reading this, and I thought, oh, she's explaining this so well. I did my thesis with the concept of on social dominance theory, and so it was great to sort of read that. But you have to take that first, and then add in, we talk about implicit bias or unconscious bias. That's a component that each of us have some bias. It's unconscious. Everybody has probably heard of the IAT and the Harvard implicit test. We ask people to do that. So we have that, and then you add in the in-group favoritism component, and that's really this idea that we tend to everybody has their sort of in-group, and they like their in-group. That in-group is a lot of different things, whether it's I always explain it when I'm giving a talk on this. Sports teams, we have these rivalries in California. We have the Dodgers in LA, and we have the Giants in San Francisco, and it's like the Dodgers and the Giants, and we all make these, if you're the Dodger fan, that's everybody else that's a Dodger fan. You have this collegiality, you have this like sense, and if a fellow Dodger fan does something wrong, you think, oh, that was just the outside situation. It's nothing wrong with them internally. They're not a bad person. But if the Giants fan does that very same thing, you think, oh, it's those Giants fans. They're always trying to scheme. It's something internal about them. We do this for everything. And so, it's college pride, right? So, isn't it Michigan and Ohio State, right? We have these in-group favoritisms, right? So, but that gets, those are sort of fun, joking things, but this is pervasive in when you look at someone and you have criteria that's ambiguous. And what makes a leader for a division? What makes a chair of a department? What makes a dean of admissions? There's a lot of different factors that go into that, and not everybody's going to have all of those. And when you see someone, you have this you look at everything together, and we have to acknowledge that there is this in-group favoritism, there is this hierarchy that's set up, and you have your own implicit bias. And aversive racism is really how we continue to use these. It's part of those concepts, and again, how we continue to maintain the hierarchy, because we make these comments that are not related to maybe their race, but they're to something else. We have these various quotes in the article. They're clearly qualified for the job, but they're too in your face. I'm worried people won't respect them. Or we hear this, I hear this all the time. They're just not the right fit. There's always the we want diversity, but we want qualified people. These are all ways in which you can make a comment that is embedded in this racism or judgment of someone, but you're not actually, and that individual doesn't actually think that they're racist. They're not doing this intentionally. They just don't realize that they are carrying these biases and this in-group favoritism, all buried under the system of this hierarchy that we in society have had. So I see it in every part of society that we live in, but academic medicine, it's there. And I think we sort of, in academics, we think that we sort of have flown above this, that somehow we're educated and we don't have these things and we're very different. And I've watched it happen time and time again, and especially as we move into leadership positions. And I think if we continue at this pace, we're not going to diversify the leadership. I think it's so important to diversify the medical school admissions, diversify the residency, especially in specialties like anesthesia and surgery specialties where we haven't seen that. It's important to do that, but then we also need to diversify the leadership, because that's what guides it. It's that those individuals that have the seat at the table, that are making those decisions on who's the next leader. It's a lot of ambiguous data that they're bringing in. And it's why in the article I talked about the college admissions, because it's something all of us can relate to. And it was a great study that really outlined how individuals, when presented with ambiguous information, if they're white, they will favor the white over the black when presented with ambiguous data. That's aversive racism. That's a great question. Yeah, I think one of the things that we have been doing, and I think is really critical, is we are bringing in leaders in DEI, JEDI. We have lots of different, jumble up the all of the letters, but I think that's really critical. Now, what I will say is important is we have to understand that the JEDI work that we do encompasses every part of the department, because it's the way that we change the culture, the climate. We also, those leaders have to have a seat at the table. And so I think it's really great that we're seeing, we have a JEDI collaborative in anesthesia, and it's growing, and that's fabulous. But if you ask individuals, each of the different departments have, enthusiastic departments and less enthusiastic, or really trying to challenge the culture. And I think we have to acknowledge and help each other to sort of move that forward. But the anesthesia leaders and the chairs and the societies have to acknowledge that this is important, and we're not going to do it unless we have, it's one thing to have that title, and I talk about this a lot. It's, what is the point of having this title if you therefore cannot do anything to make change? And that's really gets at when we talk about people who try to say, oh, we're very diverse. We have X person as a chair, fill in the blank. We have a, Mexican woman as a chair of a department, or we have a Black man that's a chair of a department. that's not enough unless they can actually be charged with, making change. And that, everybody has a boss, right? So the system actually has to say, we have to make this, we have to be able to be charged with making those changes. So the way to do that, and the way to combat aversive racism, really not just in anesthesia, but broadly in academics, is you have to have, when you're making decisions on leadership, when you're making decisions about where you're going to move, the culture and climate, you have to have a diverse set of voices. That's the way that, when we look at these studies that document aversive racism or document the sort of established hierarchy, the way that you can combat it is get more diversity at the table. And it's not just put one or two individuals, right? Because that's an uncomfortable position for being the one, right? So the more diversity. Some departments don't necessarily have that yet. So how do we do it? We bring in individuals maybe from other departments to be part of committees to make decisions. We get diversity of opinions. We make it, we always talk about a brave space. There's safe spaces, but there's a brave space. And our admissions committee, it's a brave space. We have to have these tough conversations. We have to really speak truth to power and not be afraid that we will have retaliation against that. And that's the way we have to change the system. We can't just have someone there, that looks diverse but feels uncomfortable about speaking truth to power because of retaliation. And that's a big change. I hear that over and over again. There is that sense of, I've worked so hard to get this position. If I say this, we talk about being political, but political to what end? If we're not making real change and speaking truth to power, then how are we actually going to change the system? We're just going to have it go along and pretend that we're doing these things. So really changing aversive racism is understanding the concepts of social influence and what's at play, and putting in areas and checks like having brave spaces and truly having that, and diversifying and having different views, and people being able to say them freely and without fear.